when the earth would not take Hertha. Winter had been harsh to Thomas Walker. His small farm on the outskirts of town barely produced enough to keep his family fed, and the debts were piling up like the snow that covered his barren fields. When the town council approached him with an unusual job offer, he couldn't afford to refuse. They needed someone to bury Emily Harper, a woman who had died alone with no family to claim her body. The payment would cover his mortgage for 2 months. Thomas had never buried anyone before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He borrowed a shovel from his neighbor and made his way to the small cemetery at the edge of town. The snow fell steadily, muffling all sounds except for the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground. Bare trees stood like sentinels around the graveyard, their branches reaching toward a gray sky that seemed to press down on everything below. The wooden coffin sat beside a shallow grave that the town gravedigger had started before falling ill. Thomas would have to finish the job himself. Inside the simple pine box lay Emily Harper, a woman in her 30s with auburn hair and pale skin. She wore a simple white dress, and her hands were folded peacefully across her chest. The town doctor had said she died of consumption, a common enough cause in these parts. Thomas removed his hat and said a quiet prayer. He had known Emily by sight. She lived alone in a cottage near the river, tending a small garden and keeping to herself. People said she was odd, that she talked to her plants and stayed up late reading books by candlelight. But Thomas had always thought she seemed kind the few times their paths had crossed at the general store. The work was harder than he had expected. The ground was frozen solid, and each strike of the shovel sent painful vibrations up his arms. His breath came out in white puffs as he labored, stopping frequently to warm his hands inside his coat. The snow continued to fall, dusting the coffin and settling on Emily's still form. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to feel a strange uneasiness. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. Emily had been found in her bed, looking peaceful, but there had been no illness reported, no visits from the doctor in the weeks before her death. The town council had been unusually eager to have her buried quickly, before anyone could ask too many questions. Thomas paused in his digging and looked down at Emily's face. In the dim light filtering through the falling snow, she looked almost alive. Her cheeks had a faint flush, and her lips weren't the blue-gray color he had seen on other dead folks. A terrible thought began to form in his mind, but he pushed it away. The doctor had examined her. The town officials had made their determination. He was just a struggling farmer, not qualified to question such decisions. But doubt continued to gnaw at him as he resumed digging. The grave was nearly deep enough now, and soon he would have to lower the coffin and begin covering it with earth. Once that first shovelful of dirt fell, there would be no turning back. Thomas tried to focus on the money this job would bring, the relief it would provide for his family, but his eyes kept returning to Emily's face. That was when he saw it, slight flutter of her eyelids. Thomas dropped his shovel and knelt beside the coffin, his heart pounding. He leaned closer, watching intently. For a moment, there was nothing. Then he saw it again. Unmistakable this time. Emily's eyes moved beneath her closed lids, and he could see the faintest rise and fall of her chest. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, his hands shaking as he reached toward her. "Miss Harper." Emily slowly, as if fighting against some great weight. Emily's eyes opened. They were green as spring grass, and filled with confusion and fear. Her lips parted slightly, and she made a small sound, barely audible above the falling snow. Thomas didn't hesitate. He lifted Emily from the coffin as gently as he could, cradling her against his chest. She was cold as winter stone, but he could feel her heart beating weakly against his ribs. Her breathing was shallow and labored, but it was there. "It's all right," he murmured, wrapping his coat around her. "You're safe now. I've got you." Emily's eyes focused on his face with tremendous effort. I couldn't move," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I could hear everything, but I couldn't move or speak. They thought I was ... dead," Thomas finished for her. "But you're not. You're alive, and that's all that matters now." He carried Emily through the snow toward town, his mind racing. How could the doctor have made such a mistake? How many others might have been buried alive over the years? The thought made his stomach turn, but he pushed it aside. Right now his only concern was getting Emily the help she needed. Dr. Morrison was shocked when Thomas appeared at his door carrying what he believed to be a corpse. The elderly physician quickly examined Emily, his face growing pale as he worked. She was suffering from what he called catalepsy, a rare condition that could mimic death so closely that even trained doctors could be fooled. "She may have been like this for days," Dr. Morrison explained as he worked to warm Emily by the fireplace. "Her body functions slowed to almost nothing. If you hadn't been so observant, if you had buried her as planned ... double quotes." Thomas couldn't finish that thought. Instead, he helped care for Emily as she slowly recovered. Over the following days, he visited frequently, bringing soup his wife had made and sitting with Emily as she regained her strength. They talked about books and gardens, about dreams deferred, and the simple pleasure of being alive. Emily recovered fully within a week. Though the experience had changed her, she was no longer content to live in isolation. She began visiting Thomas's farm, helping his wife with household tasks and teaching his children to read. The near-death experience had given both of them a new appreciation for human connection and the fragility of life. The town council paid Thomas his fee, though they seemed embarrassed by the whole affair. Dr. Morrison began examining bodies more carefully, haunted by his mistake, and Thomas, who had started the day as a desperate farmer willing to bury strangers for money, found something more valuable than payment. He had found a friend, and perhaps more importantly, he had found his own capacity for doing what was right even when it was difficult. Years later, when people asked Thomas about that snowy day in the cemetery, he would smile and say that sometimes the earth itself refuses to accept what isn't ready to be taken. Emily Harper was meant to live, and no amount of official pronouncement or desperate circumstances could change that fundamental truth. Some things, Thomas learned, are simply too precious to bury.